Dispatch called an unpermitted camp near marker 19 on North Ridge at 9:42 p.m. I repeated the location for the tape and wrote it in my notebook. Clear, light, frost, wind, NW 5 to 10. I told base I'd sweep markers 17:20 and be back by 10:30 unless I had to sight. Copy came with the usual valley static. I parked short of the chain and killed the headlights, let my eyes adjust until the road stopped looking like a wall. Heater ticked as it cooled. I did a gear pat-down by touch so I wouldn't need light. Mag light, radio, gloves, spray, notebook and pen, multi-tool, 2 zip ties, small roll of flagging tape. Bolt cutters stayed in the bed. Wasn't here to open anything. The chain looked right. County brass tag crimped to the 3rd link. Padlock paint ring unbroken around the eye. Hinge side showed old rub, not fresh scrape. The kiosk carried the laminated closed for season notice at all 4 zip ties. Slot box empty. Quartz in the ruts flashed when my beam crossed and went dark again. I log out loud when I'm solo. On foot from gate. Ridge sweep to 19, ETA 22:30. Base. Copied. I waited for the repeater's second little carrier click, the system hearing itself, and got it, late but present. I set a flat rock on the kiosk post as a breadcrumb so I'd know if wind or a person brushed this spot while I was up the trail. The lane to the ridge runs under spruce for the first 100 yards. Frost skinned the gravel. My boots made a dry sugar sound. I kept the beam at belt height so angles stayed honest. The creek off to my right held a steady low note. Up on the ridge, guy wires carried one thin, even ring. No chatter meant no gusts. At marker 17, the cedar post was straight and the numbers were clean. Boot traffic uphill looked old. Rounded edges, no sharp lugs, no pet prints, no bike tread. I keyed, passing 17 for the tape. Copy came back clean, then a thin echo of my line chased it from the hill, not the radio. Temperature layers do that here. I wrote double echo, likely inversion so I wouldn't improve it later. The boardwalk across the creek was slick down the center. I tested the first plank with my toe and crossed on my earlier pattern. 2 short runs, then the long. Rails were freezer cold through the glove. My breath showed as a ribbon over the water and vanished when I stepped into trees again. Marker 18 sits on a small rise. Someone had tied a strip of mylar low on a twig. People do that to find their way back to a spot they shouldn't. I cut it off and pocketed it. Beside the post, a kicked-out camp ring, stones scattered, center cooler than the air on my palm. Not warm, just wrong for the minute. I wrote dead ring, recent. The ridge meets an old fire road just before marker 19. The opening makes a pale window even at night. I swept it with the beam, left to right, fern, blueberry scrub, young birch, no eye shine, no reflectors. I keyed, approaching 19. Copy. Then that thin, late version of my own line again, from ahead. I added second echo to the same note. Marker 19 stood on its knoll, tall cedar, numbers burned clean. 2 thumb-sized rocks sat on the cap like eyes. Someone always puts them back. The spur to the overlook cut right. The old road ran left and faded into fern. The caller had said, just past the overlook, so I checked right first. The overlook had 1 beer can tipped into brush and the same carved initials that never sand out. No ember, no ash, no glass. I swept the laurel shoulder to shoulder, empty. Back at 19, the 2 small rocks were still centered on the cap. I said my plan out loud for the tape without keying it, check the old road left 10 to 15 yards, then return. I shifted the light to my left hand so my right could work zippers, or straps fast, if it turned into contact. I checked my watch 9:58 p.m. I wrote that under the call line so I'd know exactly when I stepped off trail. Then I put my right boot on the old road's frost skin and walked left, beam low, shoulders square. It was a permit check and maybe a warning. That was all it was supposed to be. I stepped off the ridge trail into the old road. The cut held cold that didn't move. Ferns lay down under a thin frost skin. I kept the beam low and centered so the edges stayed honest. 5 steps, stop, light off, count to 5, light on. The ridge noise went away behind me. No wire hum now, no creak. Just dry leaf shift and a lot of nothing. Old road tread tells on people. 1 boot pattern headed in, not fresh but sharp. Men's mid, average size, lugged sole you see at the outlet store. Heel set clean, then a roll to the outside edge. No pet prints woven with it. No smaller human print, just the one. I swept the shoulders for trash. People who don't belong leave corners, wrapper shreds, butts, bread ties, tabs. I saw none. Only a single blue nylon thread snagged at shin height on a twig. I rolled it with a thumb, pocketed it, and wrote blue fibre on the next notebook line with a quick dot to mark position. The road bent left around a birch and dropped to foot. I marked the bend in my head in case I needed to come out fast. I checked wind. Still. My breath fell short in front of my face and died. No smell except cold leaf mould and nylon somewhere upwind. Ground past the bend opened into a shallow oval, big enough for a 2-man. Less root there, as if it had been scraped years ago for a skid trail. I ran the beam left to right. A rectangle of flattened duff showed where a tarp or pad had lain earlier in the season. I pressed the back of my glove to it. Same temperature as the air now. I checked above head height for a food hang. No paracord over a limb, no bark scrape, no neat little bundle tucked into laurel. I lifted the beam along birch trunks at chest height. One showed a fresh strapline across the bark, clean crush, no weathering. Hunters hang cams there in season. I couldn't see a unit from this angle. The boot tread reappeared after the oval, set into a soft pocket, then drifted right into blueberry scrub and corrected back to centre. The pace was a touch long, someone who didn't want to linger. I stepped mine alongside, not on it, to keep the read. Lug layout matched. I kept my shoulders off the sapling so I wouldn't shake frost down my collar. 5 more steps. Light off, count to 5, light on. I listened for easy tells. Zipper teeth, a cough, stove click, a bottle rolling in duff. Nothing carried. The beam clipped a curve of fabric ahead, dull green, low, inside a ring of saplings 6 paces in from the road. No reflective tape, no headlamp sweep, no breath plume in the cold. I stood where I was and let the air settle back to even. Policy voice travels better than a shout. "Ranger, coming in on your left, I need to see a permit." I kept the light at knee height so I wouldn't blind anyone if they sat up. No answer, no zipper, no shift. I looked for the fast signs of a live camp. Food bag in reach, shoes placed toe out by a door, a stove windscreen catching light. Nothing. The area around the saplings showed 1 path in and a clean circle where feet had not scuffed. Careful entry, no milling around. I keyed once for the tape. Old road left of 19, visual 2-man dome, no movement, approaching. Copy came back clean. I nudged my radio volume down and waited. No thin echo yet. The cut stayed quiet. I moved toward the saplings from the door side so I wouldn't silhouette myself. I checked the fly cords, 1 knot right hand, 1 left. I scanned the zipper pull for fresh bright metal. The tab was the cheap silver type from a box store kit. No scratch where a tool had forced it. I paused with a hand on a sapling to feel if anything vibrated through bark. Sometimes a step does that before you hear it. The wood was still. I switched the light to my left hand so my right could work zippers or straps fast if it turned into contact. I checked my watch 10:06 p.m. and wrote that under the last note so I'd know the minute I went to the door. I set 2 fingers on the fly hem and lifted an inch to make sound if anything moved inside. Fabric made the small noise fabric makes. Nothing else answered. I raised it 3 inches more for air. I stopped again and looked behind me the way you do when the place gets smaller. My own track sat clean in the duff. No second line beside it. The bend at the birch held the same dark. I turned back to the tent and finished the last 2 steps. I put the beam on the floor through the gap. I kept it low to read shapes, not colors. Then I raised the zipper to the door height so I could see the whole footprint without touching anything else. I eased the fly up 3 inches and listened. No shift of fabric, no zipper answering me. I raised it to knee height and put the beam on the floor. The tent was empty. No pads or bags, no food. Floor nylon showed a smooth oval where a body had lain, hip and shoulder shape pressed into it. I set my gloved palm in the oval and held it. Not warm, but not like the air either. The spot kept a different cold, the way nylon does when it had contact and lost it. Zippers tell small truths. The inner mesh was zipped to the top. The outer fly pool sat centered, not dragged to one side. Both tabs faced down. Door tiebacks weren't used. People leaving in a hurry usually leave pulls crooked and tiebacks half done. This looked tidy and recent at the same time. I checked hardware in order so the report would read clean. Poles were stock fiberglass, ferrules uncracked. The ridge strap had a faint sap smear at one stitch line, glove contact. Stakes were cheap bent aluminum. The 2 windward corners had been set, pulled, then reset. Fresh V-cuts in the duff showed 2 angles. Guy lines held 2 different knots, one right hand, one left. I logged each detail in the notebook so I wouldn't try to remember it later. I swept for smalls inside and just out from the door. Tabs, match ends, torn wrapper corners, cord scraps, nothing. At the threshold, a blue nylon thread sat on the zipper tape, same shade as the strand I pocketed back on the road. I rolled it with a thumb and kept it with the first. I took 1 photo straight down at the floor oval and another wide from the door to catch stake holes and corners for scale. Phone stamped 10:08. I wrote the time. Boot sign at the door matched the tread I had followed in. Single approach, half turn at the threshold, then 1 step back like the person thought about re-entering and didn't. No knee print from a reach. Beyond that, 2 feet of clean ground, then my own prints began. The saplings around the ring showed light contact at shin height on the door side only, no brush marks around the other 3/4. I stepped out to chest height and checked the ring for hangs. No paracord bite on bark, no bag. A small birch just outside the ring showed a fresh strapline straight across the bark at chest height, clean crush, no weathering, facing the old road, not the ridge trail. Hunters hang cams there in season. I made the note, but didn't move from the door yet. I called it in so the tape would have the status. 2-man dome, empty, signs of recent use, no occupant, requesting guidance on pack-out. Base, copied. A half-second later, my sentence came back thinner from the cut, not through the speaker. I rolled my radio volume to 0 and stood still. The thin tail still arrived, only the last 2 words, pack out, soft, like air speaking. I wrote thin tail, in air, radio, vol 0, and underlined inversion, likely, so I wouldn't upgrade it later. I closed the inner mesh to halfway so I could hear any movement against it, left the fly up, and stood, without talking, for a 10 count. Nylon and leaf mold were the only smells. No sweet alcohol, no wood smoke. The air held even. The fly didn't breathe in or out against my glove. I checked again for fast tells of a live camp just out of reach, shoes toe out, a stove windscreen catching light, a food bag tucked into the saplings. Nothing. I scanned the zipper pulls for bright metal where a tool might have forced them. No scratch, no burr. The door edge stitching looked new enough that I noted the colour for later if we tried to match a sail. I zipped the fly fully closed, then lowered the inner to a hand's width and waited again, listening for fabric touch from the inside. Nothing. I took one more photo from the door side of the tent closed, stake pattern visible, saplings framing it, then stepped back to the road and logged the rule I use when there's no contact. Pack, if no return, on second pass. Before leaving, I set the rolled fly on the floor so I'd know if anything changed when I came back. If the fly stood up again, someone had been inside. I wrote fly laid flat in the margin and circled it. I checked my watch, 10:10 p.m., and wrote that under the last line. I killed the light for 5 seconds to reset my eyes and looked behind me at the bend. My own track sat clean in the duff. No second line beside it. The birch at the bend held its dark. I turned the beam back on, kept it at belt height, and followed the single boot line farther in. If there was a person out here, they had a start point. If there wasn't, I still had to get this tent out on my way back. I followed the single boot line farther in. It drifted right into blueberry, corrected, then ran clean down the centre of the roadbed. Heel set firm, outside edge roll, the same rid as before. No pet prints, no second human set keeping pace. I called again at a normal volume. Ranger, I need to see a permit. I stepped off the centre to leave a lane if someone decided to return. Nothing answered, no zipper teeth, no cough. I keyed the mic for the tape. Old road left of 19, no contact, continuing 10 yards. Base, copied. A half-second later, my own sentence came back thin from ahead, not through the speaker. I rolled the radio volume to 0 and waited. The thin tail still arrived, 2 words only, no contact. I wrote voice tail in air, radio vol 0, and underlined inversion likely so I wouldn't upgrade it later. 5 more yards and the tread doubled. Same shoe, same size, same angle. Now, 2 tracks running side by side for about 15 feet. Not a pass and return, both sets advanced together. Spacing matched one walker level with another. At the end of that, I went to the birch on the left shoulder. Chest height showed the fresh strap line I'd marked earlier. Clean crush on bark, no weathering. A small black camera sat on the far side of the trunk, tucked to face the approach. Wrong strap for that bark, cheap plastic buckle. The housing had one rubber button and a fogged window over a tiny screen. I photographed the mount before touching anything, the strap bite, the angle, the lens line relative to the road. Then I cupped my hand over the lens to kill glare and pressed the button once. These units wake, think for a second, then show the last still. The tiny red LED blinked once and settled. The grainy preview came up. It was me, same jacket, same hat, beam at belt height, stepping off the ridge trail into the old road. In the frame, my right boot was just clearing the duff. I hadn't walked past this tree yet when I pressed the button. Timestamp read 10:03 p.m. My watch read 10:14. I took a phone photo of the little screen. The preview washed out when I breathed on it, so I held my breath for the second shot. I clicked the camera back one image to be sure I wasn't looking at a default. Previous still was daylight, 2 deer nosing the road edge. I clicked forward again, back to me, mid-step, head turned a touch toward the lens like I knew it. I didn't. I checked the trail cam side panel for a second button or a menu. Nothing. 1 button only. I pressed it again to see if there was a second night frame. Some models cue 2 or 3 when they wake. The unit hesitated, flashed the LED once, then showed the same still. Same posture, same beam, same 10:03, I didn't push harder. I don't like to drive private gear out of its state. I looked around the trunk for fresh bark crumbs or drag where someone had adjusted the angle recently. The strap tail was tucked quick and dirty. No glove lint, no tape. The lens had a dust fleck at the edge. I noted it so I could match it later if wildlife pulled a card. I didn't remove the camera. It wasn't ours. People get strange about their gear. I pressed the rubber button to put it back to sleep and left it exactly how I found it. Strap tension the same, angle the same. I took one more photo of the whole setup for scale, then sketched the location in my notebook. Birch, Chia, left shoulder. Faces approach. Were 15 to 18 yards from 19. I added a dot for where my boot was in the still relative to the tree. I walked back to the tent site. I stood at the door and looked for changes I hadn't caused. The fly I had laid flat on the floor was still flat. Pull tabs were where I had left them. The stake holes were clear, no fresh V-cuts added. The blue thread on the zipper tape was in my pocket. None had replaced it. I wrote no change at tent on the line under the sketch. I keyed the radio for the tape. No contact. Packing abandoned tent for removal to gate. Base copied. I waited half a breath to see if the thin version of my line would come back from the cut. Nothing. I liked the quiet when it acted like quiet. I broke the tent clean so there wouldn't be extra noise on the trail. Poles out, elbows nested, shock cord not snapped. Fly rolled the long way and banded with an elastic, stakes together by head count. I brushed duff off the floor and folded on seams. I set the bundle on the sapling ring and did another small circle for smalls. No tabs, no caps, no paracord ends, no match heads. I checked one more time at chest height around the ring. No food hang, no bag tucked back. The small birch with the strap mark still faced the road. I slid the tent bundle onto the pack, ran a strap, and lifted. The weight changed my step enough that I noted it for the boardwalk. I took one last photo of the cleared ground, stake holes visible, saplings framing it, so if someone came back and said there had been more, I'd have what I had. Phone stamped 1018. I wrote that next to packed in the notebook. Before I turned, I stood still for a 10 count and let the place tell me if anything needed to happen here that I hadn't done. Nylon and cold leaf mold, no stove, no breath. The air didn't push against my sleeves. I said, clearing left of 19, into the mic, so the recording would have the line. I got a copy from base. No thin tail followed it in the trees. I looked once more toward the birch with the camera. The strap tail lay the same. The lens sat the same. Nothing moved off angle. I left the old road and walked my own track back toward marker 19. Beam low, shoulders square, tent on the pack. The rule was simple now. Get the gear out, log the time, and keep the sweep moving toward marker 20. I stepped out of the old road and back onto the ridge trail with the tent strapped high on the pack. I told base I was clear of the cut and resuming the sweep toward marker 20 after I dropped the pack at the truck. Copy came back, clean. I left the radio volume up this time to see if the hill would throw another thin tail. It didn't, not yet. At marker 19, the 2 thumb rocks still sat on the cap. I didn't touch them. I shut the light for 5 seconds and listened. No breath from the saplings. No metal. Only that even cold. I shook out my shoulders to settle the weight and took the spur right to the overlook one last time. Sweep, lamp low, the usual beer can in brush. No ember, no ash, nothing new. I backed out to the post and wrote 19 recheck clear under the last line. I turned downhill for the creek. Needles put a dry rattle under my boots. My earlier prints lay clean in the dust. I kept to the side so my return track wouldn't bury them. The tent bundle thumped my shoulders each second step. I counted those to keep my pace even and to put a number on how long I was on exposed board. The faint hiss of the creek came back under the wind. At the boardwalk, I tested the first slat with my toe. It held. The center run was darker with condensation. Rails were freezer cold through the glove. I stepped into my earlier ovals where I could and placed new ones where I couldn't. The pack weight gave the wood a small cry, and then it settled. Halfway across at the shadow of the center post, a second line of dark ovals split off from mine. Same stride, same heel to toe, it ran beside my track for 7, 8, 9 slats, then folded back in and was gone at the far landing. I stopped on the last plank with both feet set and let the vibration die. I crouched and put a bare fingertip on the extra oval beside mine. The wood was damp and colder than the rail, the same as the other darks. No grit score around the edge, no displaced water beads. I slid my finger an inch into clear plank. Same surface, a hair warmer. I tried the rail, colder, as expected. I took a quick photo straight down with the tent shadow cutting across my boot so I'd know which side I was on later. Phone stamped 10:23, I wrote it. I walked back 3 slats and looked for depth. My heel had pressed a shallow cup in the wet. The extra oval had the shape, not the cup. It was an image, not a weight. I said that out loud so I'd write it the same way. I pressed a knuckle in the dark beside it as a test. A small, clean dent showed next to the oval. I stood up and put that in the notes. Second line, Dan's wet image, no weight. I shut the light and let the creek take the room. No step on wood, no breath near my ear. I clicked the light back on and watched the extra ovals start to soften at the edges the way damp does when air moves. I didn't stare long enough to make more of it. I stood and finished the last 2 sections without looking back. On dirt again, I keyed the mic. Boardwalk crossed. Observed duplicate wet prints, logging as condensation artifact, continuing to gate. Base copied. A thin version of just the words had to gate drifted from the trees a second late. Not through the speaker. I noted thin tail at boardwalk exit and rolled the volume to 0 so I wouldn't chase it. Between the boardwalk and marker 17, the trail bent right. Fresh needles had dropped across my inbound prints while I was up on the ridge. That told me the wind had shifted over the saddle. I prefer that kind of explanation where I can get it. At 17, I gave a position for the tape, then added skip 20 return later in the notebook. With the tent on my back and a fresh cam location in my notes, the right choice was to clear the gear to the gate, right while it was straight, and come back for 20 clean. I didn't go back to the old road. I didn't wait at 19 to see if anyone walked out behind me. I kept my shoulder under the pack, kept the beam low, and walked toward the chain. The job now was to commit to the read. I could prove. Abandoned tent removed, condensation artifact on planks cam noted but not touched, no contact on the cut. I decided once, so I wouldn't decide again later. Then I stuck to it and kept moving. At the gate, I set the tent in the bed, flipped the cab light on, and wrote the incident before I touched the key. Location, times, empty tent, pack out, boardwalk, duplicate prints. Birch cam noted, not pulled. I told base I was clear of the ridge. Copy came back clean. A second later, a thinner version of just the word clear floated out of the trees, not through the speaker. I wrote thin repeat at gate and closed the notebook. Next afternoon, Wildlife had 2 private cams turned in from North Ridge. One was the cheap black unit from the birch, strap still wrong for that bark. They logged it. I stood at the counter while the tech read the card on a desktop. Fluorescence hummed. Monitor showed a daytime deer, then clicked into night. There I was, caught from chest height at the birch, stepping off the ridge trail into the old road, beam low, right boot clearing duff. Timestamp 22:03. I didn't reach that tree until 10:14 on my watch. The tech tapped once. Next frame. Same angle, closer. My head was turned left toward the fire road. My right hand was halfway up, like I was about to key the mic. Same 22:03 in the corner. I don't remember turning my head there. I didn't key from that spot. The tech clicked again. Empty road. Then deer. Then nothing. No person walking out. No light in the saplings. Just the two frames holding the same minute while I stood in a room full of good light and written rules. I filed the report before I clocked out. Location, North Ridge. Markers, 17:19, weather, clear, frost. Times laid in order. Actions, sweep, contact attempt, empty tent verified, pack out completed, boardwalk duplicate wet prints, observed and logged as condensation artifact, private trail cam noted and left in place. I added the thin repeats that weren't through the radio with their exact words and minutes, so future me wouldn't round them into a story. I slid the two phone photos, tent floor oval and boardwalk prints, into a plastic sleeve and wrote 22:03 at the top in block numbers, so the minute that kept showing up would sit where I could see it. I tagged the tent for lost and found. Abandoned, North Ridge. 19, hold 30 days. Stakes and poles counted, elastic band around the fly. I put the sleeve in the incident folder, signed the bottom line, and left my notebook open on the desk to the page with double echo, likely inversion underlined. If you write a decision down, you're less tempted to fix it with a better one at midnight. Next afternoon, I walked the gate with the day ranger. Chain, tag, and paint ring looked the same. My breadcrumb rock on the kiosk post still sat flat, same face up. We tightened one loose zip tie on the closed for season sign and checked the hinge bolts on the gate for shine. None. The access road carried a white line down its center where frost had burned off early. Same short sugar sound underfoot when we tested the shaded part. We went to the boardwalk. Planks were dry. My old ovals had faded to dull patches. No second-line shadows, no cups. Rails were cold, not freezer cold. I wrote boardwalk, dry, clear on the notebook line and drew a quick rectangle where the extra prints had peeled off and rejoined. The creek ran clearer than last night. Wind had moved to the other shoulder. Needles lay on top of my inbound prints where there hadn't been any. At marker 19, the two thumb rocks were back on the cap. Maybe they never left. Maybe someone set them again at dawn. We checked the overlook spur, same beer can in brush, same initials you can't sand out on a volunteer schedule. No ash, no glass. I wrote 19 a.m., recheck, clear, and closed the book because I was starting to make the trees into people in my head. Wildlife called me later to say 2 private cams had been turned in from the ridge, one matching my sketch. At the counter, the tech read the cards while I stood there so I wouldn't have to wonder. We watched the daylight deer, then the night, stills. Me stepping off the ridge into the old road, 22:03 stamped neat in the corner, next frame closer with my head turned left, and my hand half raised to key, 22:03 again. No third frame of me leaving. After that, empty road. The tech printed both and stapled a small note to the form. Clock, valid. I asked if the unit's internal time drifts when batteries sag. He said it does, but these didn't. Both frames matched the unit's set time down to the minute. He stamped retained and slid the copies across the counter. I put them in my sleeve with the tent floor shot and the boardwalk view so the night could live on paper where I could stop arguing with it. I took one more walk to the gate before sunset. The chain settled like chain. The kiosk sign lifted and fell in the same slow way when the air moved. I set my hand on the brass tag and then on the padlock body to feel if either kept anyone's heat. Both were cold and even. The ridge had that pale, honest look the light makes when it decides to go down without drama. I still sweep that route. I pocket mylar when I see it. I knock dead rings flat so they won't read as heat to the next person passing. When I pass 17, I give base a short position so the tape has a line that isn't a story. If the valley throws a thin copy of my sentence back from ahead of me, I don't answer it. I walk past 19 and keep going. Dispatch logged a caller who saw a lantern glow in the tower cab after hours. I wrote 9:15 p.m. in my notebook and added the basics. Clear, light frost, wind light out of the northwest. I told base I'd check the kiosk and stairs and be back by 10:30 unless I had to write something. Copy came with a curl of valley static I hear most nights. I parked short of the chain and killed the headlights so the road would stop feeling like a wall. Heater clicked as it cooled. Gear pat down by touch, so I didn't need light. Mag light, radio, gloves, first aid pouch, multi-tool, small roll of flagging tape. Bolt cutters stayed in the bed, towers chained for winter, and I wasn't here to open it. The chain looked right. County brass tag crimped to the third link, padlock paint ring unbroken, hinge side showed old rub, not fresh scrape. The kiosk carried the laminated closed for season notice at all 4 zip ties, slot box empty. Quartz in the ruts flashed when my beam crossed and went dark again. I log out loud when I'm solo. On foot to tower, ETA 22:30. Base copied. I waited for the repeater's second carrier click, the system hearing itself, and got it. Late, but present. I set a flat rock on the kiosk post as a breadcrumb, so I'd know if wind or a person brushed this spot while I was up the road. The first bend runs under spruce where frost skins the gravel. My boots made that sugar sound you hear right before winter decides. I kept the beam at belt height so angles stayed honest. The ridge wires carried a thin, steady ring. No chatter meant no gusts. The creak down in the dark put a low hiss under it. I shut the light at the first open cut and let my eyes hold the sky. No cars, no voices, no metal clank from a loose hatch. Just wind in cut needles and that wire note. I keyed once more for the tape. Approaching stairgate. Copy came back clean, no thin echo yet. At the chain, I pressed the shackle with a gloved thumb, no play, and looked up the black run of stairs to the cab. From here, the glass was only a darker rectangle against sky. No sweep from a headlamp. No glow on the deck. I wrote 9:22. At gate, under the call line, put the notebook away, set my hand on the rail to feel the metal's story, freezer cold even, and started up. The lower gate was chained and tagged for the off-season, brass padlock with the county stamp. Tag wire crimped through the third link. I pressed the shackle with a gloved thumb, no play. The paint ring around the eye was unbroken. Hinge side showed old rub, not fresh scrape. I took a quick photo of the lock and tag for the file, wrote the time under the last line in my notebook, and closed the cover so I wouldn't start narrating to myself. I tried the chain for weight. It sat the way chain sits when nobody has lifted it. I checked the gate frame where people sometimes pry, no bright steel, no crushed fibers, no new sawdust in the hinge pocket. The inspection tag still had the full closure date and the 2 initials from the crew. I read them aloud for the recorder so future me wouldn't swap letters later. I tested the first tread with my toe. Frost had skinned the steel, but the grip was honest. Handrail was freezer cold through the glove. You can lose skin here if you get careless. I kept the mag light at belt height, so the beam wouldn't lie about angles. One hand on the rail, one on the light. I started up. The tower keeps its own set of sounds. Guy wires carried a thin, steady ring. No chatter, which means no gusts. Leg plates ticked as the steel cooled into the night. Stairs 5 and 6 always complain once. They did, and then settled. My breath rose in a tight ribbon and broke. Boots on steel, weight even, nothing loose above me. At the first landing, I stopped and listened. Wind moving through cut needles. The creek far below, more hiss than water. Radio quiet. I didn't key it. I just spoke my location in a normal tone so the body cam would catch it. I checked the posts for bright metal where a tool might have slipped. Nothing. I put 2 fingers on the inside rail to feel for vibration, not mine. The steel red, even, and cold. I took the next run slower because the east-facing treads hold frost longer. I set my boots on the toe lines and kept a steady pace. At the mid-landing, I killed the light for a 3 count and looked back down the access road. The truck was a darker block among trees. The kiosk's white panel held a square of starlight. The flat rock I'd left on the post sat exactly as I'd set it, face up, edges true, no brush, no roll. The second dogleg turns you into the wind. I tucked my chin and kept the beam low to avoid washing the panes when I crested. A paper corner from an old summer map lay trapped under a tread. I left it. I counted the inner rail bolts by touch, on habit. 6 to the next post. The last one sits proud. It still did. Along the deck seam there was no fresh rust bloom where rain collects. The steel red, clean. At the next landing I tested the hatch chain through the gap with 2 fingers. Cold, still, weight where it belongs. I raised the beam and checked the crimp on the tag wire from the side so glare wouldn't lie to me. Fold tight. No tool marks. I tapped the hatch with my knuckles, tap, pause, tap, and put my ear to the seam. Sound came back wood and air. No loose hinge chatter. No footfall echoing the tap. I moved the light off the glass and let my eyes build the room through the dark. Through the multipane, I could make out the Osborne stand and the stool as block shapes where we left them in September. No glow on the floor. No headlamp sweep on the walls. I slid the beam across the sill to read for fresh scratches. Old paint chips were where I expected them, nothing bright. Putty lines along the muntins were cracked and even, not cut. Corners tight. If someone had slipped a sash, I would have seen the bright line. I didn't. I checked the deck fasteners along the last stringer because people sometimes spin them just to feel like they were here. No bright wrench marks, no shaved paint, no sawdust. I set my palm flat to the rail post to feel the steel story again. Freezer cold even. Uneven cold usually means a draft or a gap. I didn't feel one. My watch read 9:31 p.m. I said that time and approaching upper landing for the tape and kept the radio quiet. I don't fill the air this close to a locked hatch. I looked down the run I'd climbed so I'd know the picture I'd see if I had to come back down quick. Stairs, landings, the black wedge of road, kiosk square, truck shape. Then I turned back into the last flight. I took the final step slow, boots on steel, rail underhand, steady wire hum in the cut. I paused 1 tread below the top to let the stairs stop moving under my weight so the deck wouldn't talk over what I needed to hear. I raised the beam an inch to clear the edge, kept it at belt height, and stepped onto the upper landing. I stood still until all the small noises finished, the last tick from a cooling plate, the small shift the chain makes against the hatch with my breath, the far hiss of the creek sneaking back into the quiet. Only then did I bring my hands up to the glass to block glare. The cab was a dark box with furniture where furniture lives. No visible light source, no motion. I kept my fingers off the pane and watched the room do nothing for a full 10 count so my head wouldn't rush past the truth. Then I let my hands fall, rolled my shoulders once, and set myself to check the next thing in order. From the upper landing, the cab was a dark box with furniture where furniture lives. I brought the beam up just enough to clear the deck edge and then dropped it back to belt height so I wouldn't paste my own reflection over the glass. The Osborne stand sat centre like always, north pointer toward the far ridge, sighting alidade folded, pencil cup knocked crooked the same way the crew leaves it at close. The stool shadow fell short toward the south wall. Ordinary positions, ordinary shapes. The odd thing was not ordinary. 3 boards in from the sill, a hair right of the stand's legs, a warm circle lay on the floor. Not a cone like a flashlight makes, not an oval like a headlamp thrown from eye height, just a soft-edged pool, even all the way around as if a lantern had been set low and asked to behave. No lantern body sat in it. No cord snaked to it. The circle was light, with nothing doing the lighting. I froze where I was and let the tower finish its small talks. A single tick from a cooling plate near my left hand, the wire note stretched thin and steady across the cut, the chain's tiny shift where my breath moved air at the seam. I kept the flashlight where I like it, belt high, elbow down, and slid my boots a half step back so the pain wouldn't catch my jacket. I cupped both hands against one window light well, fingers apart just enough to vent breath sideways. Old glass throws weird. It has waves like water, and you can see ghosts of yourself if you give it a reason. Through the cupped dark, the pool stayed where it was. It did not wobble when my chest moved. It did not brighten when I shifted weight. It sat like a decision. I checked the pane itself for excuses. This cab has a mix of old and replacement glass. The lower left pane holds a bubble from the 40s. The upper right shows the faint furrows of a modern cut. I leaned across both in turn, hunting for a reflection that would carve a false circle where the boards are clean. Nothing. The only reflection I could force was the faint oblong of my belt light when I raised it high on purpose, and the warm pool didn't change, present with my beam, present without it. I breathed on the seam between panes to see where fog formed. My breath made a pale oval at my own height, and died in a second. On the floor, the light did not swell or dim with the little weather I made. I pressed my knuckles to the muntin to ground myself, felt paint that had been sun-crazed in August and gone hard again in cold, then looked past it to the boards. The grain there ran east-west. The circle sat centred across 2 boards and nibbled a third, which is how I know I wasn't misreading a knot or a stain line. The mind likes to go shopping for causes. I let it buy the cheap ones first and throw them away in order. Moon, no, stars were out, and the cab roof blocks that angle anyway. A distant car on the state road. There isn't line of sight from this ridge, and the timing was wrong for the occasional snowplow. A plane? You'd see a walk of light, not a lazy pond. My own beam? I held the flashlight against my thigh and clicked it off for a full 10 count. In the honest dark, the circle did not leave. I kept the other tests where they belong, simple, fast, and quiet. I shifted 1 pace left along the landing rail, then 1 pace right. Parallax moved the stand's legs against the far wall by a thumb's width. The light pool held fixed on the floor. I tilted my head to bring the pane's faint wave into play. The circle did not wobble. I crouched to put the sight line through the lower third of the glass. I rose until my breath made fog again. The pool stayed the pool. I put 2 fingers to the chain not to lift it, just to take its temperature and listen to the tiny talk of links. Ice cold, dead weight, no answering chime from inside, no brush of anything against the hatch. I tapped the wood twice, tap, pause, tap. The inspector's knock we all use. It came back wood and quiet air, no foot scuff, no incidental cough from a human throat behind a door they shouldn't be behind. If somebody had slipped a kid's solar puck in there as a prank, it would have shown at this distance. They look blue, and they pulse when they're cheap. This was the colour of a lamp, steady. I told myself a thing I always tell myself at the first odd turn: name it plain and park it. Warm light on floor, no source visible, I said aloud, in the same voice I used to read tag numbers. I didn't key the radio yet. I wanted the room to have exactly one line from me before I spread it to the tape. I looked down the stairs to the road, a black wedge with a square of kiosk white and the darker block of the truck. So my head remembered that the world still had edges and vehicles and tasks. And then I brought my eyes back to the glass and gave the floorboards one more chance to be dull. They stayed bright in that tidy circle, wrong and calm in the same breath. My shoulders wanted to lift. I put the back of my glove on the rail post until the steel taught me a simpler story, freezer cold even, and I kept my feet planted where they were. I said my name and the minute under my breath so I'd know which entry on the report belonged to this look. Then I made the only move that fit the handbook and my own way of staying honest. I prepared to verify in order without letting the room write for me. I started with the parts that don't have opinions. Tag first. The closure tag wire was folded tight through the chain link, crimp clean, no tooth marks from cutters, no bright flare where metal's been stressed. I pressed the next link with a gloved thumb, dead steel, no spring. The hasp screws sat flush in old wood, no bright rings where a bit would have spun this month. I wrote the tag initials aloud so the recorder would own them, and so I wouldn't swap letters later. I rapped the hatch twice with my knuckles, tap, pause, tap, and leaned an ear to the seam. It answered as wood and air only. No hinge chatter, no tiny metal footfall echoing behind it. I let my breath out slow so the chain wouldn't tick against the hatch and pretend it was an answer. I cupped both hands to the lower panes to kill glare. The Osborne stand sat where we leave it, centred, alidade folded. The stool shadow fell short toward the south wall. The logbook box sat square on its shelf. On the floor, 3 boards in and just right of centre, that warm circle held, soft-edged even, the colour you get from a lantern turned down. No lantern body lived in it. No cable reached it. No shadow shoulder where a base would block the fall-off. It was light, behaving like a lamp without the lamp. I tried to make it mine and failed in order, which is the way I like to fail. Beam at belt height, pool unchanged, beam at chest, unchanged, beam off for a 10 count, still there. I shifted a pace left along the rail. The stand legs slid a thumb's width against the far wall from parallax. The circle stayed pinned to the same 2 boards and nibble of a third. I shifted right. Same result. Old cab glass throws ghosts if you let it. This room has both antique wavy panes and 2 modern replacements from a storm 5 winters back. I put my eyes through each in turn. The antique panes rippled my belt light when I raised it on purpose, but the interior pool didn't smear or wobble. Through the modern panes, it held the same. I breathed on the seam to float a fog oval and watched where it formed. My fog sat at my height and died in a second. The floor light didn't swell or dim with it. I slid the beam across sill paint to read for fresh scrapes. Chips were where they've been since August, dull, oxidized, not bright. Putty lines along the muntins were cracked and even, not cut. Corner joints tight. Lower rail showed those small sun splits that never heal. None were new. If someone had slipped a sash, I'd have seen a bright knife line. I didn't. I pressed my palm flat against a pane to feel temperature. Freezer cold even, a kind of cold that doesn't give you anything back. If warmth were leaking from inside, the glass would hold a skin of it for one slow beat after I lifted. I counted to 5, pulled away, and watched my hands fog print ease off the glass from a height that was off by a couple inches, higher than my face. I wrote it like a measurement, not a feeling. Fog oval appeared higher than my breath, faded slow. I checked for draft the quiet way, back of my glove to the hatch seam, then along the frame, feeling for a pull that didn't match what the wind was doing on my jacket. Nothing. The air at the seam read the same as the rail, the same as my knuckles, the same as the night. I use the phone because it doesn't care what I think. I pressed the lens to the vertical muntin where two panes meet and angled up to keep my own light from washing the shot. First photo, stand, stool, logbook box, warm pool on the boards. The phone stamped 9:41 p.m. I wrote it down. I raised the phone higher, arm straight, to see over the stand's edge. In the preview, the logbook box lid looked cocked to finger's width. With my eyes, the lid looked flat. I kept the phone up and blinked slowly to make sure I wasn't catching my own blink in the glass. The preview still showed the gap. I brought the beam low and swept it across the floor to see if the interior brightness would throw a counter shadow where a real lamp would. Only the stand's legs cast, short and square. No small stump of dark inside the circle. The light itself had softer fall-off at its edges than my flashlight does, like a wick turned down, not an LED's hard rim. I don't write like a wick on forms, but I wrote soft fall-off, not hard-edged, and circled it so I wouldn't forget the difference. I checked the deck fasteners along the last stringer, habit, and because people love to turn a bolt if they can, no bright wrench bites, no shaved paint, no sawdust cone in the corner. I pressed 2 fingers to the inside rail and held steady until the small cooling ticks finished and the steel told one simple story again. Cold, even, under tension the way towers are at night when there's no gust to jog the note. I keyed the mic and kept my line plain. Upper landing, hatch secured, tag intact, interior floor illumination present, no device visible. Base, copied. I let a half-second pass to hear if this ridge would return a thin version from the room. It didn't. Just wire song and my breath. I took one more photo blind over my head to catch more deck. In the preview, the box lid gap was there again by that same finger's width. I lowered the phone and checked with my eyes. Flat. I raised the phone and took a second shot to make sure I wasn't capturing my own angle as a trick. 2 previews, same tiny gap. I wrote phone shows lid ajar, eyes rid closed and underlined, verify on recheck. I ended where I began, with the parts that don't argue. I read the tag letters and date aloud again. I put my fingertips on the chain to feel its weight without lifting it. I set my glove on the rail post until the sting of cold put the rest of me back in order. Then I said what I was doing into the mic so the tape would own the decision. Descending to kiosk to log, rechecking on return. I stood 1 beat longer to make sure the room's answer to that wasn't movement or sound. It wasn't. The circle on the floor kept its patient shape, and the tower sang its one steady line while I turned and started down. I took one more look through the glass, stand, stool, that patient circle on the boards, and said for the tape, descending to kiosk to log, we'll recheck. I palmed the rail until the stairs quit ticking and went down slow. Frost spoke under my boots a little louder than it had on the way up. The guy wires held one note, no new sounds above me. At the lower gate I checked the lock again because that's the job. Paint ring unbroken, shackle seated true, tag wire fold still tight. I pressed the chain with a glove knuckle, dead weight, then crossed to the kiosk. The closed for season sign lift-flapped once and settled. My breadcrumb rock on the post sat the way I'd left it, flat, edges square to the board. I opened the clipboard. Fresh winter sheet on top, header clean, contact box blank. I clicked the ballpoint and wrote my line the way we do. 21:15 call, 21:45 on road, 21:55 upper landing. With a short note, hatch chained, interior glow on floor, no device visible. When I lifted the pen to initial, I saw the entry above mine. 22:07 inspection, Bart lantern, on floor, return key. Neat hand, wrong first initial for my name, last name spelled right, same date. Return key isn't our phrasing. In winter, there is no key checked out. I put a finger on the time to feel the ink. Dry, not tacky. The ballpoint on the string makes a pale stroke left to right because the tip has a flat. This line didn't. I snapped a photo of the whole sheet, then a tight one of the strange entry. Phone stamped 9:52 p.m. I wrote that under my own line so I wouldn't argue with it later. I lifted the page to check for impressions. No indent on the sheet below, no pressure marks that matched our pen. The spare packet of forms under the shelf was still shrink-wrapped. The pencil slot was empty. Nothing in the kiosk moved besides the little bead that forms on the tin roof and drops off the corner every so often. I keyed the mic and kept it plain. Logged at kiosk, unexplained prior entry present, time 22:07. Text reads, lantern on floor, return key, initials do not match mine. Base copied, normal as ever. A half-second later, from up the stairwell, not through the speaker, a thin tail of my line drifted down. Just the last part, lantern on floor, like breath-catching words. I rolled my radio volume to 0 and listened. The tail still arrived, soft and late, from the direction of the upper landing. I wrote thin tail from tower, Tash radio vol 0, and circled it once. I checked the easy cheat so I wouldn't build a story out of air. Frost dust on the slab around the kiosk showed only my boot ovals and the angled skid of my heel from when I stepped up. No other pattern. The staple holes in the signboard matched last week's. No fresh tear-outs. The clipboard hinge had a little play from age, not tampering. I pressed the tip of the ballpoint into the margin and drew 2 test lines, one straight, one loop, so I'd have our stroke to compare later. Flat spot showed on the downstroke, just like always. I looked at the time on my watch, 9:53 p.m. The line above mine said 22:07. If someone had stood here and written that in the next 14 minutes, I would have heard feet on steel or a voice, or seen light on the landings. I hadn't. The chain said no, the lock's paint ring said no, the frost on the slab said no. I wrote those 4 no's in the book because sometimes the negatives are the only clean parts you get. I pressed the shackle again, harder this time, to feel for any lie in the steel. It sat honest. I laid the back of my glove along the chain to pick up a different cold if a hand had been here. Even, I ran a knuckle under the clipboard ledge in case a second pen lived there. Nothing. I checked the date line of the strange entry against mine, the same. I said that out loud so I'd stop giving myself room to claim a misread later. I closed the clipboard and set it back exactly like I found it. I took one step away and listened to the kiosk settle. Tin roof clicked, bead fell, nothing else. Up the stairs, the cab glass was only a darker rectangle again, no moving light, no strobe. The ridge wires droned that same thin line across the bowl. I told the recorder what I was going to do, so the tape would own it. Returning to upper landing to recheck interior. I opened my palm on the gatepost and felt the freezer cold steady my shoulder. For half a breath, the stairwell carried nothing but my own lungs. Then, close to where the chain touches the hatch 30 feet above me, a second copy of my last sentence arrived. 2 words only, just the tail. Recheck interior. Radio volume was still at 0. The air was still. I wrote it as a measurement, not a headline, tail phrase repeated from above. Timing 0.5, 1.0s late. I kept my feet planted until the small impulses to hurry turned into the slower decision I could live with on paper. The choice was simple. Check again, in order, without adding story. I raised the flashlight back to belt height, put a hand to the rail, and started up to see if the room would say the same thing twice. I set the clipboard back the way I found it, told the recorder I was returning to the upper landing to recheck the interior, and put a hand to the rail. Frost made a dry sound under my boots as I started up. The guy wires kept one thin note across the bowl. I left the radio volume at 0 to keep my head clean, and so I'd know if anything that sounded like me didn't come from the radio. At the first landing, I paused and listened. Wind in cut needles, no footstep echo above, no metal walk. I said the time under my breath, 9:56, so the tape would catch it. I checked the inner face of the rail for fresh shine where a hand might have slipped. Nothing. I took the next run slow. Stairs 5 and 6, complained once and settled, same as before. At the mid-landing, I looked down through the lattice. The kiosk was a pale square. My breadcrumb rock still sat flat on the post. The chain across the road drew a straight line. I held the rail with my palm until the sting of cold flattened everything else, then took the last run. At the upper landing, the hatch chain lay with the same patient sag. The tag wire fold was the same tight fold, no tool marks, no light in the fibres. I pressed the nearest link with a glove thumb, dead steel. I leaned an ear to the seam and gave the hatch the inspector's knock. Tap, pause, tap. Wood and air answered me, not metal on wood, not foot on floor. I cupped my hands to the glass and let the tower finish its tiny ticks. The Osborne stand and the stool sat where they live. The logbook box on the shelf looked square and shut. On the floor, 3 boards in from the sill, the warm circle was still there. It read a hair left of where I had parked it in my head. The kind of nudge you notice if you stare at deck grain. I marked the boards by count, 1, 2, 3 from the sill, now biting more of the second board than the third. And wrote pool appears 1-2 board left in the notebook so it wouldn't turn into a better story later. I tried to make the shift be me, belt height beam on off, chest height on off, beam cut all together for a 10 count. The circle didn't walk with my tests. Parallax didn't move it either when I slid a pace left, along the landing, then right. The stand's legs slid against the far wall like they should. The pool kept its new bite on board, too. I kept the checks in order, putty lines and muntins unchanged, no bright knife work, no cut, corners tight, sill paint chips dull, no fresh bright. I dropped the beam across the floor to see if any base inside the circle would throw a block. Only the stand's legs made a hard little shadow, same as before. I pressed my palm to the pane to feel temperature. Freezer cold, even. I counted to 5 and pulled back. A fog oval held on the glass, higher than my face by a couple inches and faded slow. I wrote that again, the way a measurement libs. Fog position. My mouth height. I breathed at my own height. The new fog sat where my breath sits and died in a second. The first oval, the too high one, had already gone. I use the phone because it doesn't argue. Lens to the seam, angle up. First shot. Stand, stool, logbook box, warm circle. Phone stamped 10:01 p.m. I wrote it. I raised the phone to arm's length over my head to see more of the deck. In the preview, the box lid showed a narrow slit of dark like it was cocked a finger's width. With my eyes, the lid looked flat. I took a second overhead shot to keep myself from claiming angle later. 2 previews, same little gap. I kept the radio volume dead and spoke to the recorder instead of the air. Upper landing recheck, hatch secured, tag intact, interior pool present, position note added, visual variance between I and phone re, box lid. I waited a half beat to hear if the ridge wanted to throw a thin copy from inside the room. The guy wires gave me their one long line. The rest was quiet. I checked the chain for a lift without lifting, fingers under, feel the belly of the link, listen for the tiny speak that metal makes when it remembers weight. Nothing. I tapped the hatch once more and stood with my ear against the seam for a slow count. Air, wood, and nothing else. I pulled back and felt that small urge in my shoulders that says, solve it, and let the rail take it. I don't solve rooms. I write what they gave me. I gave the floor one last clean try to turn into something ordinary. I stepped a pace left along the landing and crouched so my sight line went through the lower third of the glass. The circle held on board 2 and 3, more 2 than before. I rose to my full height. Same. I slid a pace right past center. Same. I took the beam off completely and watched the dark make its own decisions. The circle stayed, warm in color and soft at the edges, and I didn't have a lamp to pin to it. The choice was simple, and it lived on paper. I could call for a key pull and open a sealed cab at night for a light I couldn't name, or I could log what I had, return in day with the tower tech, and avoid adding story where I didn't need it. The handbook would let me do either. My report would read cleaner if I did the second. I said the line the tape needed to own the decision. Clearing the site. We'll return with tech in daylight for interior verification. I took one more overhead phone shot because I knew I'd want the last frame later. The preview showed the same small gap at the logbook lid. With my eyes, the lid lay flat. I didn't try the chain. I didn't call out the room's name like it was a person. I let the tower keep what it was keeping. I put my glove on the rail post until the cold put my shoulders back where they belong. I looked down the stairs to fix the route in my head, landings, the black wedge of road, kiosk square, truck. And then I stepped back from the glass, turned, and started down. The guy wires held their one note. The stair treads spoke once each and settled. The air did not carry me any copy of my own line this time. I chose the boring path because boring is what survives the report, and I kept moving toward the gate. I went down the stairs slow, rail under my hand until each tread quit talking. At the lower gate, the chain was what it had been all night. Honest steel, tag wire folded tight. I crossed to the kiosk, flipped the clipboard, and wrote the incident before I touched the key. Upper landing check, hatch secure, interior floor glow with no visible source, photos taken, recheck completed, clearing site. I initialed, capped the pen, and closed the board. The closed for seasons sign lift flapped once and lay still. My breadcrumb rock sat flat on the post, exactly how I'd set it. I keyed one last line for the tape. Clearing the site. Copy came back clean. A beat later, close and thin from the black run of stairs, not through the radio, my own word, clearing, arrived late by about a second and died in the air. I turned the radio volume fully down and stood there long enough to let the breeze move the sign again if it wanted. It didn't. I put the clipboard back the way I found it and walked to the truck. In the cab, I wrote the times onto the incident form while they still belonged to the right minutes. Heater on low. Coffee under the dash tasted like old plastic. When I looked up the stairs one last time, the cab glass was a dark rectangle against the sky. No warm circle showed from here. That's how this ridge behaves, gives you too much at arm's length and nothing from the road. I logged 10:18 p.m., clear and left. Next afternoon, I came back with the tower tech. We photographed the tag and crimp on the hatch chain before we cut it. He read the authority line off the work order, snipped the fold, and ran the chain through the staple. Inside, the air had the dry wood smell you only get when a box has been closed a while. No lantern in the room, no battery smell, no cord. The warm circle that had sat 3 boards in the night before wasn't on the deck in daylight. The Osborne stand, stool and sight marks were where they live. The logbook box sat square on the shelf with the lid cocked a finger's width. We opened the box and set the book on the stand. The last page had a fresh line dated with last night's date and written in a tidy, unfamiliar hand, 2207 inspection, lantern, on floor, return key. Wrong first initial for my name. Last name, correct. The time matched the kiosk entry that wasn't mine. The tech looked at me, then at the line, then at the cut tag in his hand. We didn't talk about it. He wrote opened for verification, reseal in his block letters under the entry, and closed the book. When he stepped back onto the landing to reseal the hatch, I put my palm to a pane from the inside to check what my breath would do. The glass took a fog oval that wasn't where my mouth was, higher by a couple inches, and it faded slow. I watched it go, then followed him out. He crimped a new tag on the chain with his pliers, read the digits into his phone for the record, and nodded for me to take the photo. I did. The lid on the logbook box lay flat now, like it had never held that narrow gap. We didn't argue with it. We shut the hatch, checked the tag by touch, and walked back down to the kiosk without saying anything that would turn it into more than what it was. I wrote the incident before I clocked out so the minutes wouldn't slide. Location, Fire Tower Access Road, Upper Landing, Kiosk. Weather, clear, light, frost, wind. NW light. Times in order. Actions, approach, hardware verified. Interior floor illumination, observed with no device visible. Photos taken, over glass, 2 angles. Descent, kiosk entry, noted, not mine, 22.07, lantern on floor, return key. Reascent, small positional variance of floor light recorded. Phone vs. eye discrepancy at logbook lid. Decision to clear and return in daylight with tech. Sight cleared. I printed the stills and slid them into a sleeve with the timestamps written in block numbers on the tab. I kept the lines plain so I wouldn't improve them later. I compared the kiosk entry to my own on the copy. Hand was tidy, not mine. Wrong first initial, last name correct. The phrase return key doesn't live in our winter vocabulary. I wrote that as a note so it wouldn't get rounded off in retellings. I clipped the sheet to the report and signed the bottom line. I left my notebook open to the page where I'd underlined thin tail from tower, radio vol 0, so the next person on shift could read the line without me explaining it. Next afternoon I walked the chain with the day ranger. The tech's fresh tag sat where the old one had been. Crimp was clean. Paint ring unbroken. I read the digits into my phone and took a close photo of the fold so the file would have what the chain said and not what I remembered. The kiosk carried the same closed-for-season laminate. My breadcrumb rock on the post still lay flat, same face up. We flipped the clipboard. My line lived where I'd left it. The 2207 entry above it looked greyer now, like old ink. I took a photo of that too so I wouldn't have to argue with my head about colour later. We climbed with the tech, opened the hatch under his authority, and did the inside checks I'd written for. No lantern, no cord, no heat marking the boards. The air smelled like dry wood and old dust. The logbook box lid had that finger's width gap until we touched the box. When we closed it and stepped back, it stayed flat. The tech resealed the chain and read the new tag digits out loud while I shot the photo. Neither of us said what we thought. We don't put that on paper. Back at the office, I added the tag photo and the interior verification to the incident and filed the lot. 2 phone stills from the landing, 1 kiosk sheet close-up, one tag close-up, summary page. I wrote a short postscript for the log so the detail wouldn't turn into a story on its own. If you hear a late copy of your last line near the stairs, check your radio volume. If it's already at 0, note the words and the delay, then move on. That's as much advice as I felt like giving. On the next week's nights, I drove past the chain, parked out of the headlight wash, and walked up just to put eyes on the same rail and the same glass in the same cold. Nothing showed from the road. The tower sang one line when the wind lived in the wires, and none when the air lay flat. I checked the kiosk, flipped the clipboard, replaced a cracked zip tie on the laminate, and set the rock flat on the post again, because it costs nothing to know if a place has been touched. The light on the boards has not shown for me again. The 2207 line reads the same in the copy as the day I saw it. The tag crimp looks like a crimp should. The hatch chain lies the way chain lies when nobody asks it to do anything. I don't bring bolt cutters unless the work order tells me to. I don't call the room by a name. I read what's in front of me, write it clean, and leave it alone. When I key my clear at the gate now, I leave a breath between the last word and the truck door so the hill can do whatever small thing it's going to do with my voice. If it throws a thin tail back down the stairs a second late, I don't answer. I log it and leave. Early spring is a liar in this district. Trailheads look like April. The shadows still sound like February. I signed the truck log at the winter gate, wrote 1335, en route to Lake 12, lean to, replace logbook, check roof in my notebook, and told base I'd be out of reliable radio by the saddle and back at the truck by 16ers unless I hit blowdowns. Copy came through clean with a little ridge flutter. I put the new shelter book, a blank-bound pad in a zip bag, in the top of my pack, so I wouldn't have to dig for it with cold fingers later. The first mile is roots and weeping mud between alders. I kept my steps on the knuckles of roots to stay out of the chocolate. Old snow sat in the pockets that never see noon, grey on top, blue underneath where it refreezes each night. My boots made that felted sound that lives between slush and bark. The air smelled like wet wood and the ice you get in a freezer when a door doesn't seal right. I logged a small wind from the west because it decides which shoreline you walk later if the ice is still out. I keep my checks boring and in order, pack cinch, radio where I can hear it, map case clipped, small stove canister faced, label out so I can read the fuel level without lifting it. On my belt, multi-tool, small first aid pouch, tape. No saw today, last week's trail crew took the big leaners. I passed the cut stump of their work and noted the bright sawdust still trapped in snow, which told me the shaded parts would be slick all the way to the lake. I wrote snow on north faces past 1ME so I'd remember on the way out and not fall in my own head. The trail kinks at a granite rib where kids carve hearts into lichen when they think nobody will know. The lichen here remembers everything. The cuts were old and dark. One fresh boot set had come in ahead of me, single adult, medium size, lugged sole, the same outlet pattern I see all season, pace even, stride a hair long for the grade, no pet prints braided with it, no smaller set. I stepped mine alongside, not on top, out of habit. If a thing turns into a report, you want your own track, separate from the picture you're taking in your head. At 1.8, the trail pinches through fur. Old needles made the floor soft and dry until the shade grabbed the mud again. I shut the radio and keyed once so bass would have the saddle time on the tape, then listened for the return click. It came thin and late, the way it does when you're sliding behind the knobs. I wrote radio unreliable beyond saddle so I wouldn't get mad at it later and pretend it owed me more. The lake announces itself with sound before sight. In late melt, you get a low, soft boom when the wind flexes the ice plates and the shoreline answers back. Today it came like a far cupboard door closing in a house you don't live in anymore. The timber around the water still had its winter stance, branches down and tight, green turned to something with less opinion. I tasted the air for wood smoke because people slip in and try to ride a shoulder season without a permit. Nothing sweet, nothing burned, just cold water, and that freezer leak smell. The lean-to sits on a slight rise above the east shore where the wind can't bully it. The roofline showed over the last hummock, shingles true, ridge cap still tacked. Bare cables hung between two pines with the loop, hardware glinting dull. The front bench looked like itself. The slab in front was half mud, half ice scab, and the old logbook box sat where it should on the inside right wall, brass turn button closed. I said arrived out loud to nobody, so the body cam would take the word and put it where it belonged when I played it back. I took the pack off and set it on the bench so the bottom wouldn't wick up the wet. The new logbook came out of its zip bag clean. I ran a glove over the roofline from inside to feel for daylight. None. I tapped the back wall with the knuckles and listened for a hollow that would mean a mouse had made art. It answered as wood and old air. I put the new book in the box, kept the old one under my hand for a second to read the weight, then lifted the brass turn and opened it. October was the last entry. Leaf peepers with better names than mine had said the lake was glass, and signed a heart between initials like pencil could hold a season they liked. After that, nothing. I slid the new book on top, closed the box, and turned the brass down until it bit. I wrote 1407 roof bench, OK, logbook replaced in the notebook. I made myself breathe through the next line before I wrote it, so the time would belong to the minute when I looked at the water. The far shore was still under plate ice where the pine shadow lives all day. The near shore was clear enough that wind pushed a skin of water against the ice edge and then pulled it back. That's the sound you get, a hush, a far cupboard, a hush. No footprints cut the mud at the landing, no stick figures of last night's teenagers. A fox had come down and walked the edge, toes knitting dimples into the thaw and weaving back up through birch. I followed its line with my eyes because eyes are honest when your head wants a story. I tried the radio from the point where reception sometimes bounces off rock and comes back. Lake 12 lean-to, 1 ranger, replacing logbook, will depart 15:15 if nothing to repair. Nothing answered. The ridge was a shoulder turned away. I said the time out loud again for the recorder and watched my breath go flat in the cold and then disappear. The wind shifted a notch and the lake boomed once, the sound coming from under the ice like a room moving its furniture without you in it. I ate standing at the bench, stove cup balanced on a flat I trust, flame low so it wouldn't flirt with dry needles. Food was just heat and salt. I looked at the 3 faces of the shelter and the slab just beyond the drip line and told myself the pieces I would write later. Roof holds. Any winter heave is minor. Cables intact. Box replaced. No trash in the ring. I kept the sentences short because the job is short when it's honest. I poured the boil into the pouch, capped the stove, and left the cup where steam could talk to the woods and not to the logbook page. Before I left, I walked 20 yards of shoreline in each direction for smalls, foil, tabs, match ends. Nothing. The fox print stitched in and out, thin and tidy. The ice sighed once and fell into itself a finger's width at the seam. I looked down and saw my boot print grow dark with thaw and then go back to pale when the next small wind moved the cold around. I wrote 1422, shore clean, ice active, and circled active because it tells you where sound is coming from later when you think you heard it behind you. I went back to the bench, wiped the cup, slid the new book's first page open to the date, and set my pen up to make the kind of line that reads later as a line and not a paragraph. Before the tip touched paper, the lake boomed again, low, closer, like a hallway in an empty building. I paused and let the sound finish. Then I wrote the date, the hour, and the least words I could live with about what I was doing there. The handwriting looked like mine. The page looked like a page. I turned to put the old book under the new one in the box so the file in town would start clean. Something thin and white under the box lip caught the beam that came in around my shoulder. A single loose leaf sat there, torn from a binding like the one in my hand, edge ratty, date line filled in with today, and a time I had not reached yet. 1507, the first sentence in that tight, familiar hand said, "Arrived alone." Ice booming, I looked at my watch, 14:41, and put my finger on the paper without moving it so the minute would stop trying to argue with me. I said the time out loud so the recorder would own it. Then I read the line again and let the lake breathe while I decided how to write the next one. I kept my finger on the loose page and said the time again, 14:41, so the body cam would own the minute. Then I did the boring checks in order so this wouldn't get to be a story before it was facts. Paper first. Weight and tooth matched the new book stock, not the old full one. The tear showed 2 binding holes and a ratty edge that lined with the wire comb pattern our supplier uses. Date line was written in my block style. The 7 had my crossbar, not the open European one. The minute read 1507 in the same hand. I pressed the pad of my thumb near the colon to feel for raised ink ridges. Gel sits up on paper for a while. This line felt flat, like it had had time to dry before I ever saw it. I lifted the sheet an inch off the board to check the underside for indentation. Nothing obvious. I photographed the page as it lay and again held in my hand with the lake behind it, so I would know where I learned it. Box next. I emptied the log box onto the bench. New book, old book, 1 golf pencil chewed by a porcupine last summer, a brass turn washer, 3 dead flies. No other loose sheets. I checked the underside lip for a snag where paper might ride. Clean. I pressed the box corners against the bench, no hollow slosh that would tell me something was trapped inside. I wrote box clear in the notebook, bench and floor. I looked for page scraps or torn chads. None. No fresh boot grit on the plank where a person would swing feet. The stove cup still gleamed wet inside, steam thread thin. The ground at the drip line showed the cup's 2 water spots where I had sloshed and nothing else. The shelter's front slab kept my earlier boot ovals, no second set cut across them. Perimeter. I walked the 20 yards each way again, slow. I checked the places people tuck things, under the back lip of the bench, in the corner where the lower log meets the side wall, behind the sill of the roof, if their fingers can reach. Nothing. The fox trail stitched from birch to shore and back out. The toes were crisp where the mud held shape and blunted where melt had softened the top. No human toe drag, no heel push, deeper than mine. I tried the radio from the better bounce point again. Lake 12 lean-to, 1 ranger, routine replacement complete. Departing 15:15 if no repair. Nothing came back. I watched the screen for the transmit icon to confirm I had actually keyed. It blinked, then died. I said the line out loud anyway so the recorder would hold it, even if the ridge wouldn't. Back at the bench I set breadcrumbs. Not because the woods owes me tricks, but because later I won't trust my memory. I put the old logbook under the new one with the spines flush and the titles facing opposite ways. I laid the loose sheet under the new book, lower right corner, out a finger's width so a small wind wouldn't take it, and so a photo later would show whether it had shifted. I set the golf pencil at a 45 across the book's top edge. I turned the brass turn button vertical instead of horizontal. I put a flat pebble from the slab on the near bench corner and a pine needle straight as a pointer across it. If anything small moved, I would know which thing and how. I wrote my own clean line on the first page of the new book: date, time, roof, bench, cables, old book removed to office, my initials. I kept it short and square. I signed the old book's last page with today's date and book replaced. I photographed both pages, the bench and the box arrangement, as I left it. Phone stamped 1453. I wrote that so I wouldn't backfill later. The lake boomed again, longer this time, as if the plates were pushing and hanging instead of slipping. I walked to the landing and watched the edge. The water skinned up, kissed the ice, and fell back. No person scent in the wind, no smoke. I marked which way the wavelets ran when the wind freshened. They moved east to west along the open lane, normal for the shift. I wrote wind, W 5 to 7, ice active, and circled active a second time. I checked the bare cables because that is part of the job, and because looking up breaks your habit of staring at the same square of plank. The pulleys spun freely, no chew on the sheath. The throw line coiled clean around the lower peg. If someone had hung food last night, they'd have left a kink or a twist set. None. I checked the eaves for hornet paper from last fall that might have torn down and hidden a scrap of anything useful. Only the grey lace you get when winter chews nests to threads. Back at the bench, I opened my notebook to the line where I'd written 1441, loose page, and added what I could say cleanly without building a shape. Matches new stock. Time written 1507, hand consistent with mine. Sheet placed under new book. Pencil at 45, turn vertical, pebble, needle bench corner. I underlined mine so I wouldn't soften it later with similar. I took 10 slow breaths with my eyes on the lake and my hands off everything. The shelter made wood sounds it always makes, small contract ticks. A jay screamed once, out past the birches. The ice answered itself somewhere under the plates. I looked at my watch, 14:58, and set it for the recorder. I had 17 minutes until the loose paper's timeline. I decided to do one more routine lap the way I would if there were no page at all, privy check, and the short spur to the point people think is a trail but isn't. I walked the privy spur, glanced inside for winter damage, found the usual mousework and a dead moth, and shut the door. On the way back, I froze for a count when I hit the point where radio sometimes catches. The wind went down and the ridge tilted its shoulder and said nothing. I kept walking. On the fake spur, I found where someone had tried to start a path with heel drags last fall. The snowmelt had erased it. I broke 2 dead twigs on purpose and left them obvious, so the next person would know not to take the turn. Small things help strangers more than speeches. When I came back around the lean-to front, the bench still had its pebble with the pine needle pointer, the pencil still cut the book's top edge at 45, and the brass turn button still stood vertical. The loose sheets corner still peeked a finger's width from under the new book. I tapped the bench once with my knuckle, so the body cam would have the sound of me being here at 14:58, then picked up the stove cup, shook it dry, and slid it into the pack's side sleeve. I didn't turn the page over, not yet. Routine first, the same way I would have done at any other shelter on any other cold afternoon. Then the line at 15:07 could have whatever minute it was going to have without me crowding it. I zipped the pack, set it on the bench with the straps tidy, and stood with my back to the lake so the cam would catch the box and the books in one frame while the ice did what the ice wanted. I stood with my back to the lake so the body cam would hold the box, the new book, and the loose sheet in one frame. I said the time out loud, 14:58, and listened. Shelter wood made its small, settled ticks. A jay worked the birches and quit. The lake gave a long, low boom that sounded farther than it was. I breathed once and let it go where it wanted. I photographed the setup again because pictures argue less than heads. First wide, bench, box, book. Second tight. The loose sheets corner under the new book, the pencil crossing the top edge at 45, the brass turn button standing vertical, the pebble with the pine needle pointing east. Phone stamped 1459. I wrote that in the notebook under breadcrumbs set. I turned enough to get the lake in one frame with the shelter edge and took a third shot. Phone stamped 15. When I looked back at the bench, the pencil lay parallel to the book's top edge instead of at 45. No roll sound, no bump I could name. The brass turn button still sat vertical. The loose page still peeked a finger's width from under the new book. Pebble and needle still read the way I left them. I kept it boring. I did not touch anything. I took a fourth photo tight on the pencil as it lay now, parallel, and a fifth as I held the phone over my head to catch more bench. Stamp 1501. I wrote pencil drift to 0 degree, no sound, in the notebook and underlined no so I wouldn't give myself a memory of hearing one later. Then I reset only the pencil back to 45 degree, took a sixth photo, and wrote reset 45 degree, 1501. If wind had done it, it would keep doing it. The air on my wrists read even and cool. I watched for easy cheats. The bench plank isn't crowned, it's flat. The book's cover has tooth. A pencil doesn't slide on it without help. The angle I had set wouldn't roll towards 0 unless something nudged it. My sleeve was clear, my pack straps didn't sweep the bench. Nothing in the shelter carried enough of a draft to push a pencil across grain. I wrote those as negatives instead of thoughts and put the cap back on the pen. The lake boomed again, longer, like two plates pushed and hung. The sound felt close enough that the bench top hummed under my glove. I said, "Copy that," out of habit, and heard my own words come back thin from the direction of the water, not from the radio. I rolled the radio volume wheel all the way down to 0 and tried again. Normal voice. Lake 12-1. The thin copy returned a second late, only the last word. What? Laid over the hush. I wrote thin tail from lake, radio, Vol 0, last word, only. 1 point nose late. Deniable. The bowl throws sound when temperature stacks wrong. I put my palm to the brass turn button and felt the metal tell its simple truth. Cold, even. I did not turn it. I pressed a fingertip against the new book's top edge near the pencil and felt the paper's drag. Honest. I angled down to check the loose sheet's corner. It still sat a finger's width out, lower right, square to the board. The edge was dry, no water or grease line that would glue it in place or pull it out. I walked 10 paces to the landing and came back in one line so my boot patterns wouldn't start to look like someone else's. At the bench, the pencil lay at 45 where I had reset it. The pebble and needle still pointed east. The brass turn button still stood vertical. The loose page still peaked the same. If I had made the change with a sleeve while I wasn't looking, the photos would show it. That's why I take them. I made a small mark at the corner of the loose sheet with a graphite dot you could only see close, on the bench side, so I'd know if the sheet moved even a millimeter. I wrote graphite dot, wall, bench, side. I looked at my watch, 15:03, and said it. The ice answered itself out past the shadow line. I kept my hands off everything and gave the setup a full minute. Nothing moved. I breathed on my gloved knuckles to feel if wind had come up enough to shift paper or a pencil. It hadn't. I reached to my pocket, pulled the notebook, and wrote the plan I would have written whether or not anything strange had happened. At 15:06, walk to point, try radio, stand still at 15:07, note lake and box, Do not add steps. I said the plan out loud so the recorder would own it. I didn't open the box. I didn't peel the loose sheet free. I let the minute walk itself to 15:05 with my back where it had been and the bench in the frame. The lake boomed once more, lower like a door closing at a distance you can't put a number on. I didn't build a shape out of it. I kept the pencil at 45, fingers off, and waited for my watch to roll. Image cues, early spring shoulder season. 3:04 pound 3:10 p.m. Overcast, bright, northeast US backcountry, lean-to at Lake 12, East Shore. Bench with new logbook, loose sheet tucked under lower right corner, pencil set at 45 degrees, brass turn button vertical, pebble with pine needle pointer, short footpath to a rocky point, lake half-iced with grey plates, light west wind, ranger timing actions to the minute, phone photos for timestamps, radio volume at 0 while testing echoes. I watched my second hand sweep past 3:04 and said the time for the recorder. The bench setup was as I left it, pencil at 45, loose sheet corner out one finger, turn vertical, pebble and needle pointing east. I took a wide photo and a tight one of the corner with the small graphite dot I'd placed on the bench side. Phone stamped 15:04, I wrote it. I kept the plan I'd written a minute ago. Walk to the point at 15:06, try radio, stand still at 15:07, then return and read the bench with fresh eyes. I added one more breadcrumb before I moved. I laid a second pine needle across the first, at a clean 90-degree, tips even, and photographed that cross with the book edge in frame so the angle would mean something later. Phone stamped 15:05. I said 15:05 out loud and put the phone away. I left the pack on the bench and took the 10-yard path to the landing, then the next 20 along the shore to the rock point people mistake for a trail. I counted my steps, 38 to the landing, 22 to the point, so I'd know the time to return if I got pulled into listening. Fox tracks stitched the margin where water wet the mud and then dried. No human heel drag. No toe scuff. The wind came from my left cheek, west, steady at maybe 5. The ice plates under the pine shadow creaked once and fell quiet. I looked back at the shelter to fix the picture in my head. The bench sat at a slight angle to me. If anything in the setup shifted while I watched the water, the phone time would say when I learned it, not when it happened. I turned the radio volume up one click and keyed a standard line. Lake 12 lean-to, one ranger on point for radio check. Nothing came. I watched the icon, saw transmit, waited, and got no return. I rolled the volume back to 0 so anything thin I heard would be air, not speaker. I said the minute into the wind, 15:06, and stood still. The lake's open water skinned up, kissed the ice, and fell back. The boom came late by maybe 3 heartbeats far left under the plates, like a cupboard door in a house you don't live in. I kept my hands off my pockets and let the sound finish instead of chasing it with a second call. When the boom eased out of the trees behind me, I counted 3 breaths and turned back toward the shelter. At the lean-to front, I stopped at the slab's edge and read the bench without crossing in. Pencil lay at 45 where I had set it. The pine needle cross held 90 degree. The brass turn button still stood vertical. The loose sheet's corner still showed a finger's width, square to the board. The graphite dot I'd put on the bench edge still sat where I could see it, glossy and small. I took a tight photo of that corner with the dot and the book edge. Phone stamped 15:07. I wrote arrived, bench, were 15:07, no change, by eye. I stepped in, set my palm on the turn button to take the metal's temperature, cold even, and then off it again, so I wouldn't add a change with my own hand. I stood square and let the recorder have what I had. Bench as set, pencil 45, needle cross 90, loose sheet corner 1 finger, dot present. I kept the words short so future me wouldn't be tempted to fix them. I checked for cheats a second time. Bench plank is flat, not crowned. The book's cover has tooth. A pencil doesn't glide across it unless something lifts it or pushes the eraser. The pine needles are dry. They'll blow if there's wind inside a box. And there isn't. I licked a knuckle and held it still at waist height. The shelter's interior air read motionless. No draft at the box. No corner seam leak. The only movement belonged to the grey plates out on the lake. I put my weight on my heels and watched the page corner. No lift, no sink, no creep under the book's edge. I marked the lower board where the paper met it with the tiniest graphite tick on the wood grain, right where the torn edge made a notch. I said, "Mark placed out loud," and logged it. To keep the check honest, I walked a short square, 3 paces left to the side wall, pause, 3 paces to the back log, pause, 3 to the right wall, pause, 3 back to centre. I kept the bench in my peripheral even when I wasn't looking at it, so my head wouldn't build a gap. When I stopped in front again, the picture matched the one I left. Pencil 45, cross 90, turn vertical, corner 1 finger, dot and tick where I put them. I used the phone for the angle my eyes don't get. Overhead shot, arms locked to catch the book top, and the pencil line with the bench slats for square. Preview showed the pencil clean on a diagonal across the top edge and the cross a perfect T. I took a second overhead with the shelter and lake both in frame. Phone stamped 15-8. I wrote it next to overhead. I did a heat test on the paper because I've seen thin drafts grab a page under a box and then let it slip when the day warms. I pressed the back of my glove to the bench for a slow count, cold even. I pressed 2 fingers to the exposed corner of the loose sheet, also cold. I breathed on the corner from 8 inches to put a gloss of moisture on it. The fibre took the breath and shed it. No curl, no slide. I said no curl and set my hands away from it. I checked the box hardware again without turning it. The turn button's slotted head was still vertical. The screw's single nick was at the same angle relative to the grain. I put my ear near the box seam and held my breath. Wood, air, no insect pick, no mouse scratch. The brass read the same cold as before. I felt my jaw pull tight and let the rail of the front sill take it for a count of 3. That usually sets me back where I can read and not think. I took 1 step back, framed the whole bench, book and box in the phone, and shot the wide. Then I shot the cross. Then the pencil. 3 photos in a row, so the stamps would build a line. 1508, 1508, 1509. I wrote them as a row in the notebook. I have a rule about not flipping pages I didn't place unless the report needs it right then. The report didn't need it yet. The line on the top of the loose sheet read what I'd already seen. Today's date and 1507 with the sentence, "Arrived alone." Ice booming, same block hand as mine, no second line, no backside ink showing through. I didn't turn it, I wrote "did not flip" and underlined it, because later I'd want to. I did flip the new logbook's first page and checked my own line from 10 minutes ago. Still square. No pen drag across it. No second stroke in the same hand. I closed it and set the pencils still 45. I photographed that with the timeline across the bottom edge, so the frame itself would say where the minute was, and not me. 1509. I tried the radio once more from the shelter mouth with the volume still at 0, so my ear would stay honest. Lake 12, 1, status check. Air and wood gave me nothing. I rolled the volume up 1 notch and tried again. no copy. I rolled it back down to 0. The ice under the pine's shadow boomed once and came apart in a crackle I could see at the far seam. The sound moved under my feet a beat later, soft like a sheet settling. I looked at my watch, 15:09 rolling to 15:10, and said it. Then I put the notebook away and did the part that makes the rest of this livable. I wrote, in order, what I would do next, and didn't add anything. Hold setup as is. Step to point again at 15:12. Radio on voice then off. Return at 15:13. If nothing changes, flip the loose sheet at 15:14. Photograph both sides. Log exact words. Leave by 15:15. I read the steps out loud so the tape would own the sequence. I stood with my back to the lake again and let the cam take the bench into its little square. The pencil kept its diagonal. The needles kept their cross. The page corner kept its one finger. The turn kept its vertical. The dot and the tick sat where I put them. I let the scene live without my hands for the last half minute of 15:10, then looked at the water and waited for the next sound to tell me whether I had a routine afternoon or a report. I let the last seconds of 15:10 finish with my back to the lake and the bench in frame for the body cam. Pencil held 45. Needle cross held 90. Loose sheet corner sat one finger out, squared. Brass turn button stayed vertical. I said 15:11 out loud so the recorder would have the runway into the next steps. Then I walked the short square again. Wall, back log, wall, center. So later I couldn't claim I'd lost track of the scene. At 15:12 I took the path to the point like I'd written I would. 38 steps to the landing, 22 to the rock. I counted because numbers pull panic out of your shoulders. I rolled the radio volume up one notch and keyed a simple line. Lake 12 lean-to, 1 Ranger, radio check. The transmit icon gave me its blink. Nothing answered. I rolled the wheel back to 0, so any thin repeat I heard would have to belong to the bowl and not the speaker. I stood still and said the time, 15:12, the way I say trail numbers for the tape. The lake's open water skinned up, kissed the plate edge, fell back. The boom came as a far cupboard door closing in a house I only ever visit. It ran under the ice from left to right and ended behind me in the trees, like someone set a heavy book down on a shelf you can't see. I let that finish and counted 3 breaths. Nothing else. I turned toward the shelter. From the point, I could see the bench, oblique, pencil just a diagonal fleck, cross a T. I walked back with my boots inside my own step so the slab wouldn't start telling 2 stories. At the slab, I stopped and read the bench before stepping in. Pencil, still 45. Needles, still 90. Turn button, vertical. Loose sheet corner, 1 finger out, the graphite dot on the bench edge, still glossy. The tiny graphite tick on the board grain, still where I'd put it, near the torn notch. I took a tight photo on that corner, and then an overhead of the bench. Phone stamped 15:13. I wrote return 15:13, no visible change. The plan I'd written said, if nothing changes, flip the loose sheet at 15:14. I stood with my hands at my sides until my second hand crossed toward 14, so I wouldn't rush the minute. I said the time, then leaned in and put 2 fingers on the sheet's exposed corner. Paper told me its simple truth. Cold, dry, a hair stiffer than summer stock. I pinched the edge, lifted straight up, and turned it like I was trying not to tear an old photograph. Front held what I'd already read. Today's date, 15:07, 1 sentence. Arrived alone, ice booming. Same block hand as mine, not metaphor, just what a line needs to be. Back carried more ink. The top third had 15:12 underlined once, then 7 words in the same tight hand, walk to point. 1 call, no copy, wait. I looked at my watch, 15:14, and said it. I didn't add the thought out loud that I had done exactly that. I took a photo of the backside where that line lived. Phone stamped 1514. I put that time in the notebook so I wouldn't later argue the order. Under the 1512 line sat 1513 with two short items in the same hand. Back to bench. No change. Photograph corner. I had done those in that order, to the word. My throat did that dumb, tight thing. I set the sheet down on the bench with the backside up and took a second photo so backside would be a picture and not a claim. 1514 again. The bottom third of the page held one more time, 1515, with three simple lines beneath it, each with a small, square bullet. Turn key, sign the book, depart. The brass turn button in my peripheral looked tall and foolish. I didn't touch it. I set the pencil on the book's top edge, still 45, the cross, still 90, and laid the sheet down so the 1515 lines faced up. I photographed that arrangement with the phone held high. Stamp 1515 rolled as I watched it. I wrote sheet flipped, back shows 1512, 13 done, 15 instructs and underlined instructs because reports don't like that word. I do not like being told what to do by paper. I said for the tape, not following prescriptive lines. Will hold setup as is and leave at 1515 without keying box. Calm voice. Same tone I use when I read tag numbers. I picked up my pack so the body cam would catch the motion, then stopped because of the one thing I should have thought of first. If the sheet was writing or being written by some other dull thing like time drift I don't own, it would say more if I gave it room. So I put the pack back on the bench, pulled out my notebook and wrote the unromantic test. Observe. No action. 60s. I left the sheet backside up. 1515 sat there with the three square bullets. I said 1515 hold out loud and put my hands flat on my thighs so I wouldn't find a reason to twitch a small thing out of place and give my head a victory later. The ice under the pine's shadow gave a long, low crackle like someone unplugging a radio. The bench under my left hand hummed a quiet hum you can feel and not hear when the shore moves water an inch and puts it back. The cross stayed a perfect T, the pencil held its diagonal, the corner held its finger, the turn stood there like it had opinions. I let the minute walk itself all the way to 16. Then I picked the sheet up again. The 1512 and 1513 lines were as they had been. Under 1515, a fourth square bullet had appeared in the same tight block hand, squeezed under depart in the margin like whoever wrote it had realized there was room for one more small idea. It read, "Do not turn around." That is a sentence reports don't like even more than instructs. I set the paper down. I photographed the additional bullet with my watch face in the corner and the shelter wall in frame so I would not get to claim angle or light made it later. Phone stamped 1516. I wrote new bullet added during hold in my notebook and underlined during because if I let it blur, it would come apart into something easier. I didn't turn around because the sentence had said not to, but also because there wasn't anything behind me I needed. The lake was behind me. The lean-to front was in front of me. The radio sat in my chest pocket with the volume at 0. The world was small and full of cold and wood. I moved the test back to what I could own. Voice check, I said, in a normal tone toward the box, not the water. A thin echo of just the last word, check, came from the lake behind me late by a second. Radio wheel still on 0. I said, voice check, again. The thin return brought only voice this time. Wrong half first. Soft like breath pushed through the slats of the shelter wall. The timing made no good sense. I wrote, thin tail, order variable, by ones. I put 2 fingers on the brass turn button to feel the metal's story and took them off. I didn't turn it. I slid the loose sheet under the new book, the way it had lived when I found it, lower right corner a finger out, backside up, so the 1515 line looked at wood. I set the pencil back at 45 across the booktop, checked the cross, 90, and added one more breadcrumb because I learned slow. I put a pea-sized stone on the page corner, so any draft would show as a clack rather than a slide I could lie about later. I said what I was doing into the recorder so the tape would hold me to it. Leaving the setup as found plus one small stone on loose page, not turning the key, not signing the book, departing at 15:17 instead of 15:15. If a rule wanted to write for me, it could work the extra 2 minutes out on its own time. I shouldered the pack and stepped to the slab edge. Then I stopped, because the parts that don't have opinions had one more thing to say. My graphite dot on the bench edge near the sheet corner was gone. Not smeared, gone. The tiny graphite tick I had put in the board grain at the torn notch line was still there, untouched. I took a tight photo of the place where the dot had been, my thumb in frame pointing at nothing, because nothing that used to be something is a kind of fact. Phone stamped 15:16. I did not go hunting for the dot on my sleeve or the floor or the book. I didn't want to find it. I wanted to be out. I told the recorder the line I needed to say to make leaving honest, departing now. Then I backed the 2 steps to the path without turning, put my shoulder against air instead of the lake, and walked the 38:22 count to the point and back toward the saddle, with the radio volume still at 0, so if anything followed me, it would have to use the trees and not the speaker. The lake boomed once, low and patient. I did not answer it. I kept my boots in my own tracks until the birches took the water out of my ears and left me with mud and roots and the kind of quiet that belongs to a trail in early spring. I said, departing now for the recorder, shoulder slung the pack, and backed 2 steps to the path without giving the lake or the bench my face. The sentence on the sheet had said, do not turn around. I didn't, not because paper gets to boss me, but because my report reads cleaner when I don't pick a fight with a dare. I kept my eyes on the ground I meant to use and walked out on the 38:22 count I'd logged earlier. At the landing, I stopped with my toes on wet rock and let the lake finish its say. Open water skinned up, kissed the plate edge, fell back. The boom walked under the ice from left to right and died in the firs, like a book set quietly on the wrong shelf. I said 15:17 for the tape and rolled the radio wheel to 0 a second time so I wouldn't get cute and accidentally check it. The trail pinched into alder where mud grabs your heel. I kept my boots on the root crown so I wouldn't leave a smear over my inbound prints. I counted my breaths into 10s, another way to make the body act like policy when the head wants a story. At 20 breaths I passed the birch that holds a woodpecker ring and the fox stitch that ran up and away from shore. The stitch showed in the same places as it had on the way in, dimples where cold held shape, blunted where melt softened the top. No fresh human set braided with mine. The urge to look back is a physical thing, not an idea. I let it live in my shoulders and gave it to a tree each time it got loud, palm to bark, feel the cold step. The woods like to ask if you're coming or going and then pretend the answer matters. It doesn't. I was going. I said going once into the recorder, so future me would have the word where it belongs. At the granite rib, the footing goes from sponge to stone and sound carries different. When I stepped onto the rock, a thin version of my last departing now came up behind me from the lake bowl, not from the speaker, late by a second, and only the last word now, like breath through a seam. I wrote thin tail, last word, only source lake, one's late in the notebook without stopping. I said voice check in a normal tone toward the uphill, not the water. A thin answer came after the same beat, but it arrived backward, Check, sucked a voice, like a scrape of words folded wrong. I added order variable to the same line and kept moving. Halfway to the saddle, the trail crosses a piece of snow that never sees noon. My inbound heel cup sat there, blue over grey. I put my outbound heels inside my own cup so I wouldn't start telling a second story. At the mid-drift, a shallow oval showed beside my track where no boot had been, a weightless shape punched in the crust without a depth cup. I set a bare knuckle to it. The crust dented under my finger, cold and honest. The oval beside it was only a shade difference, not a depression. I photographed it with my pen for scale and wrote wet image, no weight, and kept the words as small as the thing deserved. At the little rise where radio sometimes bounces off a rib and says hello, I let my boot stop. I didn't key the mic. I left the volume at 0 and spoke once, the way I would if I were telling bass I'd cleared the lake. Leaving 12. The thin answer came from behind me, leaving, minus the noun, as if the bowl was short of breath. I rolled the wheel up one notch and keyed properly. Lake 12 to base, departing site, returning to truck, ETA 1600, no contact with public. Nothing came back. I watched the transmit icon blink alone. I rolled the wheel down to 0 again, so I wouldn't waste the battery on a ridge that wasn't listening. The afternoon dulled a shade, the way it does when overcast decides it will be night soon, whether you like it or not. I kept my hands off branches that wanted to slap my face on the narrow pinches, so I wouldn't have to put the glove to my eye and give myself a reason to stop. The woods held even, wet wood, cold water, no sweet smoke, no warmed plastic. Near the fir tunnel I set a breadcrumb out of sheer spite at the part of my head that wanted to invent, just a dead twig broken clean and set crosswise on my inbound toe line, so I'd know if anything foot-sized had walked behind me and then past me. 10 breaths later, I looked down where that twig should be and saw it still crosswise and my inbound heel cups intact. The trail hadn't improved itself. Good. At the saddle, the ridge turns your voice back the way a wall does. I said, "Saddle out loud." The return came thin, not from the speaker, a second late, only the first half, sad, like somebody clipped the rest. I wrote clip in the margin and underlined it because if I didn't, it would grow teeth by the time I found the gate. On the far side of the saddle, the alder gives way to taller spruce, and the mud gives way to honest duff. I let my breath change without calling it anything. The 1507 line on that loose sheet wanted to live in my chest like a number on a test. I put it where it belonged, on paper, sheet, front 1507, back 1512, 1513 lines, consistent with actions. 1515 list appeared before choice. Do not turn around, added during hold. I kept it plain because plain survives retelling better than clever. I passed the cut stump where the trail crew had taken last week's leaner. The bright sawdust was wet now, darker on top from air. I touched it with a glove finger the way you touch a stove you don't believe is off. Cold. I said 1530 for the recorder and counted the last 50 steps down to the winter gate so there would be no honest gap for the woods to slip into and say it spoke for me. At the gate, the truck looked like a truck looks when it hasn't moved, glass dull, a line of leaf crumbs along the wiper, one gnat under the dash sun strip. I put the pack in the bed and set both hands on the cold of the tailgate to measure whether I was shaking. I wasn't. The wind had nothing new to say. The road behind the chain held the same 2 sets of tire marks it had held when I walked in, mine and last week's crew. I wrote the shape of the choice where it belonged on the form on my clipboard. At 1515, list present, turn key, sign book, depart. Added, do not turn around. At 1516, while observing, no action, taken per list. Exited without turning. Radio unreliable. Thin tales heard from Lake Ridge, not through speaker. Order of tale words variable. No public contact. I left it at that. I did not add my opinion of paper that writes bullets. Opinions go stale faster than mud. Before I keyed a clear for the tape, I did the one small thing that keeps me from telling lies to myself later. I looked down the road toward the lake, with my chin over my shoulder and my eyes on the chain, not on the woods. And I said clear, if the bowl wanted to throw back a thin copy from that distance, it could. It didn't. The only return I got was a repeat of the creek farther down the valley, and the sound of my pen cap snapping home when I capped it. I climbed in, left the heater off so the cold could keep my head straight, and wrote the clock time big on the line I was going to carry back to the office. 15:35 departed Lake 12. The lake boomed somewhere under all that ice and water and wood in a way you feel more than you hear. I didn't give it a second line. I turned the key and let the truck be a truck. I put the truck in the slot by the office door and carried the pack in without turning the heater on. Cold keeps your head square. I wrote 15:35, departed Lake 12, big on the incident header line, then unpacked in order, so the report wouldn't have to wrestle my memory. Old logbook to lost Kai found, docks bin with a sticky flag. Loose sheet into a plastic sleeve. Phone cabled to the desktop. Body cam on the dock. I said 3:55 for the room mic and rolled my chair up to the desk lamp. Paper first. Under raking light, the loose sheet showed what I already knew. Our supplier's smooth stock, wire comb tear with 2 clean perforations and a ragged slope between, same tooth as the new book. Front. Today's date, 15:07, arrived alone. Ice booming. Back, 15:12. Walk to point. 1 call, no copy. Wait. 15:13. Back to bench, no change, photograph corner. 15:15 with 3 square bullets, turn key, sign the book. Depart, and the 4th crammed under in the margin. Do not turn around. All in tight block hand that looks like mine when I behave. I hunted for indents beneath the visible lines, the ghosts you get when somebody presses hard. None. The strokes sat flat. The gel had lived long enough to marry the fibres. Phone next. I pulled the stills. 14:59, pencil across the top edge at 45 degree, 15 quati, pencil parallel to the top. No hand in frame, no sleeve shadow, no bump. I can blame. 15:01, pencil reset to 45 degree, my knuckle and pen cap both visible. A run of bench-wide, tight shots with the graphite dot by the page corner and the tiny graphite tick in the board grain. 15:07, tight on that corner. 15:08, 09, overhead angles. 15:14, the sheet flipped, backside up with the 15:12, 15:13 lines. 15:15, the bullet list in frame. 15:16, same shot with do not turn around, jammed under depart. Last, the empty spot where the dot had been, my thumb pointing at a nothing. The ESCIF clock held true against the desktop clock to the minute. I wrote ESCIF, tad wall clock, consistent and circled 16 once. Body cam audio gave me what the woods had given me. My lines in the tone I used to read tag numbers. The lake's cupboard door booms under the plates. The thin tails that arrive late and wrong from behind me while the radio wheel sits at 0. You can see the thumb roll to 0 on the footage, then hear E1 a beat later without a speaker hiss. The stairwell at the tower does that too, but this wasn't a tower. I clipped the 2 cleanest late tails and stapled a note to the incident. Tails recorded, source ambient, wheel 0, so somebody else wouldn't have to listen to 40 minutes to learn the 2 parts that matter. I held the loose page up to the monitor and matched my photos to the ink. The 15:15 bullets live clean in 15:15 frames. Do not turn around appears only in 15:16. If I had built that line myself, I would have a frame with my hand. I don't. I wrote added during hold in block letters because my head likes to round off edges if I let it. I took one last pass under the desk lamp across the sheet's backside for gloss. Gel does a thing under raking light when it's new that it doesn't do an hour later. The strokes read old enough to be quiet. No proud ridge, no wet shine hiding in joins. Whatever the sheet was going to be when I first put a finger on it at 1441, it already was. I stapled copies of the stills to the incident and slid the page into the sleeve with a note on top. Retain. Examine W, wildlife if needed. Then I did what the handbook calls for when paper starts writing jobs for you. I asked the day ranger to walk the lean-to with me in daylight and look at only the parts that have no opinions. He said tomorrow. I wrote tomorrow. Next afternoon, we followed my boot ovals over the last bit of mush and roots in a sky that couldn't decide between rain and sun. The lake had gotten honest, plates pulled back to the pine shadow, the open water a cold sheet. The shelter stood like shelters do after winter. Angle true, eaves dry, somebody's initials trying and failing to be an event on a lower log. We went in quiet. The bench held the new logbook where I left it. The pencil lay parallel to the top edge, eraser scuffed like it had rolled and stopped. The pine needle cross I'd laid at 90° was a V now, one arm slid off by a finger's width toward the lake. The pea-sized stone I'd set on the page corner wasn't on the bench. I found it dull and wet under the lip where spring drip lands. The brass turn button sat horizontal, not vertical. The loose sheet was nowhere visible. I photographed the board where the graphite dot had lived. Nothing. I put my thumb in the corner again so the picture would have a scale for gone. I showed the day ranger the tiny graphite tick I'd cut into the bench grain by the torn notch line. It still lived there, dull grey, right where I'd set it. He nodded, no jokes, no eyebrows, and set the desk lamp we'd brought in the pack on the bench edge for a cheap, oblique light. We opened the box. My short, square line on the first page of the new book sat like I left it. Below it, nothing. We ran the raking beam across the paper at a low angle until the fibres threw shadows. The first page held shallow, blind impressions you couldn't see unless the light skated sideways. Square bullets pressed into the stock near the lower half, a little margin line where a last sentence had lived at the exact angle I had seen it jammed under depart. No ink, just pressure. The day ranger leaned down until his cap brim hid the page and said, "There, like you say when you spot a trout before you throw a fly." We didn't write it down, we photographed it. We checked the second page, then the third. Nothing impressed there. Back to the first. One more pass with light. If you knew what to look for, you could trace a soft 1-5-1-2, one line broken into short strokes where square bullets would sit, the gutter of a margin note at the corner where my knuckle had set that graphite dot yesterday. I don't put poetry in incident reports, I put pictures in sleeves. We took 3 more, all from different angles, and backed away so we wouldn't turn a faint fact into a better one by wishing. I checked the brass turn button again by touch, horizontal, a hair warm from our wrists. I set it vertical and stepped back. The day ranger set it horizontal and stepped back. We agreed, without saying it, to leave it vertical the way I'd left it. He closed the lid gently, the fibres whispered. No click you could call a latch, these boxes are old. We walked the short run to the water just to remind ourselves that ice has its own schedule and doesn't care about ours. No new human prints had braided with mine. The fox stitch had softened into nothing. I keyed the radio from the point to see if the ridge would be generous in daylight. Lake 12 lean-to, 2 rangers, day recheck. Copy came back once, clean. No thin tails from the water when we stood still for it. Back at the bench I slid the new book an inch and looked under, where the loose sheet had lived yesterday. Clean board, no wet outline, no pulp lint. We put the book back square and photographed the top again. Pencil parallel, needle arms open in a V, turn button vertical now because that's the way we left it. I carried the first page photos to the office like you carry a thing that can't be replaced, and printed one at 8x10 so it would live in a sleeve where eyes could find it. Desk lamp raking across the big print makes the blind impression show right away. The little square before where a word would start, the gentle trench of a line that holds no ink, and the short margin stroke where that last instruction had run out of space. The file calls it Photo Raking Light, page 1. I call it the only picture I trust of the part of the afternoon that keeps trying to be a story. I added one more boring line under findings on the incident form and left it there. New book page 1 shows blind impressions consistent with backside of loose sheet as observed. 3. Impressions photographed, no signatures added, box position left as found. I slid the still in with the tower stills and the boardwalk prints, and the 2 paper copies that have 2203 stapled to them from a different ridge on a different night. The office fluorescents hummed the way they do when they're tired. I shut the folder gently so the picture would stay a picture and not a paragraph. I filed the packet the way I want someone to find it 5 years from now. Header clean, timeline in order, findings boxed, photos numbered. On top, I slid the 8x10 print you can read without squinting. The first page of the new book under Raking Light with the square bullets pressed into the paper and the faint margin trench where the last sentence had to live under depart. Under that, the phone stills in sequence. 14:59 pencil, 45 deg, 15 how pencil parallel, 15:01 reset, 45 deg, 15:07 tight on the corner with my graphite dot, 15:14 the backside with 15:12, 15:13, 15:15 the 3 bullets, 15:16 the 4th bullet jammed underneath, and the thumb shot of nothing where the dot had been. The body cam clips were short and boring the way I like. My lines in the tag reading tone, lake booms like a far cupboard, thin tails returning late with the radio wheel at 0. I wrote retain, paper and audio on the sleeve tab and put the packet in the drawer with the tower prints and the boardwalk pair. I don't shelve them under unexplained, I shelve them under dates. Dates behave. I added 2 short notes to the staff board because those are the kind that help. If you need to test invisible impressions on a page, take a cheap desk lamp and rake the light low. Photograph perpendicular, then oblique. Don't rub. If the bowl throws you a thin copy of your last word with your wheel at 0, write the word and the delay. Don't answer the air. The next week I walked back to Lake 12 with a spring work crew on the far trail and no reason to open anything. The lake had changed its mind. The near water was a cold sheet, and the shadow plates were gone. The fox stitch was water now. The lean-to smelled like dry wood, and last year. I stepped to the bench and read what had been in my head all week, like a line you don't want to see printed. The new logbook sat where I'd left it. The pencil lay parallel to the top edge. The brass turn button was vertical, the way the day ranger and I had left it. The afternoon, we did Raking Light. The pine needle cross I'd made was just a V now and not even a tidy one. No loose sheet lived under the book or behind the box or on the floor. No pea stone sat on the corner. I lifted the lid, checked page 1, and read only my square little entry and the paper's faint pressed ghosts under light, the bullets without ink, the small gutter where the last sentence had gone. I closed the lid and let the turn sit vertical. I didn't leave another needle, I didn't set the pencil to 45 degree. I'm not in the business of giving a place a script. I walked 20 yards of shore both ways out of habit, checked the bare cables, tapped the roofline, and listened for daylight. None. And stood a full minute at the landing like I'd stood on the day the ice still had a voice. Without plates, the lake had less to say. A small wind pushed a skin of water to the stones and let it fall. I said 1620 for the recorder and left without adding a sentence to page 2 that didn't need me. On other nights there was nothing to carry. At a south trailhead 2 counties over, I keyed in a routine line after locking a gate, clear at the lot, and a thin clear came back wrong out of the trees a second late while my wheels sat at 0. It was a soft copy, like breath moved through brush. I wrote the word and the delay, turned the heater down and called it the bowl-playing temperature tricks. At a campground kiosk on the west side, I set a flat rock on a post so I'd know if someone brushed the spot while I was in the loop. When I came back, the rock sat flat, and my own pencil line on the night sheet was the only new mark. That is the shape of most of the job, and I am fine with it. I don't write the thing I want to write most, because it turns too fast into something you put on a shelf and feed, but I keep a private rule now on the lake loops and the ridge circuits where sound plays back. When the line I just said arrives thin and late from a place I'm not looking at, I don't give it my face. I give it a line on paper with the word and the seconds, and that's the end of it. When I pass a shelter, I do one small boring thing to prove the world I'm in is the one I can write. I square a book to the bench, or I set a pencil so it won't glide. I don't come back to see if it did. That isn't my work. My work is to replace the log, count the cables, feel the roof for light, and leave the place cleaner than I found it. If a page wants to carry 2 minutes I haven't lived yet in my handwriting, it can do it once, and then it can sit in a sleeve under a date where it matches nothing but itself. The last time I climbed to the tower with the tech, he made a joke at the bottom of the stairs about me being the one who hears the late copies, and it wasn't unkind. At the upper landing, he shook the hatch. The chain told him its simple steel story. He asked if I wanted the key. I said no and wrote the time. Through the glass, the floor was just dark boards. We stood long enough to hear the tower sing its one line and then quit. On the way down, I said, clearing stairs into the mic for the tape because that's the line, and nothing thin came back from inside the cab. Not then. Back at the office, I added a 1-sentence postscript to the Lake 12 packet. Not a conclusion, not a thought, just the part you could hold. Daylight recheck with second ranger. Page 1 blind impressions photographed, no ink added, loose sheet not present, box left as found, subsequent visits uneventful. I initialed the corner so it would be mine and slid the file back where dates live. Sometimes when I'm closing the drawer, the 8x10 of page 1 slides a hair in the sleeve and the square bullets catch the light like they're printed when they're not. I don't call anyone over to look. I don't say anything. I turn off the lamp, cap my pen, and let the room go back to buzzing. On the next night I'll say clear at a gate and wait a breath to see if the hill wants to play copycat. If it does, I won't turn the way a sentence once suggested. I'll write the word and the seconds and I'll leave. That's the job. I filed the packets under dates, not explanations. North Ridge, an empty tent that kept the shape of a body, a trail cam that stamped me at 2203 before I could have been there, and the boardwalk prints that were picture and not weight. The tower, a pool of warm light sitting patient on the boards with no lamp to blame, a tidy line at 2207 that wasn't mine, and a lid that was shut to my eyes and ajar to the phone. Lake 12, a loose sheet in my hand that already knew 1512 and 1513, then told me to leave at 1515 and not turn around, the first page later, showing its bullets pressed into the paper with no ink at all. Across all three, the woods did the same small trick, gave back the last piece of my voice thin and late from a place I wasn't looking at, with the radio wheel sitting at 0. The words arrived clipped or backward, harmless as breath, and that was enough. The rest stayed metal and paper, tags that read what tags read, chains that told their steel story, forms that said what I could prove, and nothing more. I don't argue with it. I write what I touched, where I stood, what time the clock said, and what didn't move when it should have. I leave the sights the way I found them or cleaner, and I drive the miles between gates with the heater low so the cold keeps my head square. If a ridge throws a copy of my last word a second late, I let the air have it. If a page wants to carry a minute I haven't lived yet, it goes in a sleeve under the right date. The only advice I keep is small and boring. Don't give the place your face when it asks for it. Don't answer the air. Pin your details to times and leave. Out here, most of the night is honest. Wires sing when the wind asks. Rails get cold and stay that way. Snow remembers your boots and forgets them. When the other kind of minute shows up, it doesn't last. You make your line on the form, you close the box, you lock the chain, and you walk away.